Welcome back to the channel. Make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you never miss an update or a new analysis. There is a chair that has sat empty in the United Nations Security Council chamber for 3 days. Not physically empty, someone sits in it, but the weight of what used to fill that seat, the credibility, the gravity, the unspoken authority of a nation that wrote the rules of the modern world, that is gone. And the moment it became undeniable was not a war, not a financial crash, not a missile test. It was a Tuesday afternoon in London when Britain did something it has not done in 80 years. It chose a direction, and that direction was away. Let that land for a second. The United Kingdom, the country that gifted the world parliamentary democracy, that bled at Dunkirk, that held the line alone in 1940 before anyone else showed up, just made the most consequential foreign policy pivot since the Second World War. Quietly, methodically, with the kind of cold British precision that only happens when someone has been pushed far enough and decided, finally, that enough is enough. This is not speculation. This is not a theory. The documents are signed. The calls happened. The architecture is being built right now, while most people are watching football or scrolling through their phones, completely unaware that the world they wake up to tomorrow looks fundamentally different from the one they went to sleep in last night. Here is what actually happened, and here is why it matters to you personally in ways you are not yet fully seeing. Britain's move did not begin with a headline. It began with a series of private humiliations that accumulated over months like water filling a room. Slowly, then all at once, the trade demands sent to Downing Street from Washington were not the language of allies. They were the language of a landlord talking to a tenant who is 3 months behind on rent. Adopt American food standards within 30 days. Dismantle 6 years of post-Brexit regulatory work that Britain built with its own hands. Sanction every British company with ties to Chinese technology firms, wiping out $34 billion in existing contracts and gutting the country's infrastructure rollout overnight. And then the demand that reportedly made Starmer go very quiet in his chair: redirect 40% of North Sea energy output to America at a discounted rate, not because of any strategic necessity, but to lower US gas prices before a domestic election. Britain's sovereign energy resources used as a campaign prop. One senior figure in Whitehall described the demands as colonial in tone. That word was chosen deliberately. It was not hyperbole. It was a diagnosis. What does Britain do with a diagnosis like that? A weaker government stalls, hedges, sends a polite non-answer and hopes the pressure dissipates. What Starmer did was different. He did not stall. He began, quietly and without public announcement, to build an exit. The calls with Ottawa started before most people were paying attention. Mark Carney, methodical, precise, a man who spent years at the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada understanding exactly how financial systems are built and how they break, had been having his own conversations with Canberra. Anthony Albanese, governing a continent that sits geographically closer to the rising powers of Asia than to the Atlantic world, had been watching American reliability evaporate in real time. 3 leaders, 3 separate sets of grievances, 1 converging conclusion. Then came the interview that lit the match. The exact words are what matter here, because words from the most powerful office in the world do not evaporate. They land in war rooms and situation rooms and on the desks of foreign ministers who have to decide in real time what those words mean for their country's future. Australia was told in plain language that it is a nice country with beautiful beaches that needs America more than America needs it. The implication being that Australian strategic interests are essentially decorative, that 80 years of Pacific alliance, of joint intelligence infrastructure, of Australian soldiers dying alongside American ones in every major conflict of the modern era, amounted to a transaction that Washington could terminate with a shrug. The United Kingdom was called a loser. Not a struggling partner, not a nation going through a difficult transition. A loser. The country that produced the intelligence frameworks American agencies rely on every single day. The country whose signals infrastructure at GCHQ covers half the planet's communications. Called a loser on camera in English by the leader of the nation it has stood beside without exception since 1941. Stop here and ask yourself something honestly. If someone called your most loyal friend a loser in public and that friend had been there every single time you needed them, what would you expect that friend to do next? Write your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think loyalty actually means in 2026. The clip reached Downing Street in under an hour. Starmer watched it. Then he picked up the phone and said 4 words to his foreign secretary. Those 4 words set in motion a chain of events that will still be reshaping global trade, intelligence sharing, and currency markets when most of the people currently making noise about it are long gone. The call between Starmer, Carney, and Albanese lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. What came out of it was given a name that sounds bureaucratic but carries the weight of a tectonic shift: the Commonwealth Economic Security Compact. 3 economies, 3 currencies. A financial architecture designed explicitly to route significant volumes of global trade without touching the US dollar. Not as an act of aggression, not as a declaration of war, as a simple, structural, irreversible fact. Think about what that means for a moment. The US dollar's dominance in global trade is not just a symbol of American power, it is the mechanism of American power. Every time a barrel of oil is priced in dollars, every time an international trade invoice is settled in dollars, every time a foreign government holds US Treasury bonds as a reserve asset, that is a direct subsidy to the American economy. It keeps borrowing costs low. It keeps import prices manageable. It funds the deficit. Remove even a meaningful fraction of that demand, and the effects are not abstract. They are your grocery bill, they are your mortgage rate, they are the value of whatever retirement savings you have spent your working life building. JP Morgan dropped, Goldman Sachs dropped, the US dollar index fell in a single session by its largest margin in 6 months. Those are not numbers in a financial news ticker. Those are the first tremors of a structural adjustment that economists have been saying for 20 years was eventually coming. It just needed a trigger, and Washington handed the trigger to the people most capable of pulling it. Here is something that is not being said loudly enough. Britain did not do this because of one interview or one set of trade demands. Britain did this because a strategic calculation was made at the highest level that the cost of continued dependence on an unpredictable Washington had exceeded the cost of moving. That is an extraordinary statement. The United Kingdom built its entire post-empire foreign policy around the transatlantic relationship. The special relationship was not just a phrase, it was the organizing principle of British statecraft for 80 years. And the people running British foreign policy looked at the current trajectory, ran the numbers, modeled the scenarios, and concluded that the relationship as it had existed was no longer a reliable foundation. That is not a tantrum. That is a strategic verdict. The phone call that followed the compact signing is where the full picture becomes clear. Washington called London. The tone was not diplomatic. There were threats, 35% tariffs on Scotch whisky, suspension of intelligence cooperation, cancellation of a state visit. Each threat was designed to isolate Britain, to make the cost of the compact feel immediate and personal and painful. What happened instead is that Starmer responded with a calmness that came not from weakness, but from a man who had already made his decision and was no longer negotiating from a position of need. The response on whiskey referenced prohibition and 2 world wars. The response on intelligence reminded Washington that the intelligence relationship runs in both directions and that GCHQ's contributions are not a favor received, but a partnership of equals. The final line of the call, that Britain's only regret was that the conversation had been necessary at all, traveled through every embassy in the world within hours. Not because it was dramatic, because it was surgical. What do you think the long-term consequence of this moment will be? Not in 2 years, in 20 years. Drop your prediction in the comments right now, because the range of possible futures here is genuinely wide and genuinely consequential. Now, let's talk about what this means for the Five Eyes, because this is the part most analysis is missing entirely. Five Eyes is the intelligence sharing arrangement between the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It has operated continuously since 1946. It is, without exaggeration, the most consequential intelligence alliance in human history. The breadth of what it collects, the depth of what it shares, the integrated nature of how it operates, there is nothing else like it. And it runs fundamentally on trust, not on contracts, not on formal treaties alone, on the accumulated trust of 80 years of shared risk. That trust is now under active renegotiation. When 3 of the 5 members of that alliance have just formalized an economic and security compact that was explicitly constructed in the absence of the other 2, the intelligence architecture does not immediately collapse, but it begins to stratify. Information that flows freely today flows with a question mark tomorrow. Sources that are shared without hesitation today are shared with a degree of caution tomorrow. And this is not theoretical. This is how institutions work when the political relationships that underpin them shift. And the consequence for American intelligence capability is profound. GCHQ coverage alone spans communications infrastructure that US agencies cannot replicate independently, lose full British cooperation, and American agencies become selectively blind in parts of the world that are becoming more strategically important, not less. Trump did not cost America an intelligence asset with a policy decision. He cost it with a personality trait. The inability to treat allies as anything other than subordinates, the compulsive need to extract rather than invest, the failure to understand that the Anglo-American intelligence relationship was not a service America purchased, but a partnership America participated in. These are not policy failures. They are character failures with strategic consequences. Meanwhile, the 3 Commonwealth currencies rallied. The FTSE climbed. The Toronto and Sydney exchanges both moved upward. Markets were reading the compact not as a crisis, but as a rebalancing. An acknowledgement that global economic gravity has been shifting for years, and that 3 advanced economies had just decided to stop pretending otherwise and start structuring themselves for the world as it actually is, rather than the world as American foreign policy mythology describes it. Carney stood at the podium with 3 flags behind him: Canadian, British, Australian. The space where a 4th flag might have stood was empty. He did not mention it. He did not need to. He said something instead that is going to be quoted in diplomatic history for a generation. The Western Alliance was built on trust. We are simply relocating trust to where it still exists. 11 words. The most consequential sentence spoken at any podium this year, possibly this decade. Relocating trust, not destroying it, not rejecting it, relocating it to where it still exists. That is a sentence that contains both a verdict and an invitation. The verdict is that trust no longer exists in its previous location. The invitation is that this is a relocation, not a permanent exile. The door is being left ajar, just barely, for a Washington that eventually finds its way back to something recognizable. But the door is no longer being propped open. Britain, Canada, and Australia are done waiting. The compact runs for 25 years. 25 years. This is not a reactive measure. This is not a temporary arrangement to be dissolved when the political winds in Washington shift. This is infrastructure. Supply chains will be built around it. Financial systems will be calibrated to it. Investment decisions worth hundreds of billions of dollars will be made on the assumption of its permanence. By the time any future American administration tries to reconstruct what has been lost, the new architecture will be load-bearing. You do not demolish load-bearing walls with a press conference and a state dinner. The thing that keeps coming back, the detail that stays in the room after everything else is said, is how unnecessary this was. The Anglosphere was not a fragile thing. 5 nations bound by common language, common legal tradition, shared democratic institutions, and 80 years of sacrifice alongside each other. It was the most durable informal alliance in the history of the modern world. It did not need to be maintained with great effort. It needed only to be respected. The instinct to dominate it, to treat it as a resource to be extracted from rather than a relationship to be honored, did not strengthen American power. It dissolved the one alliance that was most naturally and organically aligned with American values and American interests. History will not be kind to that choice. Not because historians are harsh, but because the consequences will be visible and measurable and impossible to reframe. You cannot spin a currency index. You cannot narrativize a 30-year supply chain restructuring. You cannot tweet your way back into an intelligence architecture that has quietly begun routing around you. Carney said it plainly. Personalities change, systems endure. He was talking about what they had just built, but the sentence applies in both directions. The personality that triggered this will eventually leave the stage. The system being built in response will not. One final question, and this one matters to this channel specifically. Where are you watching this from right now? Because the meaning of this moment is different depending on whether you are sitting in London, in Toronto, in Sydney, in New York, or somewhere else entirely. This is not one story with one impact. It is a story that lands differently in every capital, every household, every retirement account, every border. Tell me where you are, and tell me how this feels from where you are standing. The geography of this moment is part of the story. The map in the White House Situation Room, the one with allied nations in blue, with Britain and Canada and Australia as the inner circle, the family, the alliance that history built and common sacrifice cemented. That map is going to need to be redrawn. Not because anyone wanted it redrawn, because the people responsible for maintaining what it represented decided that dominance was more valuable than partnership. And the partners, patiently, professionally, and with the kind of quiet resolve that does not make for good television but makes for durable history, decided to find each other without them. The post-war order was not defeated. It was not conquered by a rival power or dismantled by an ideological revolution. It was vacated by the nation that built it. And the nations left standing in the architecture it created looked at each other across an ocean and decided that the architecture was worth more than its absent architect. That is the moment we're in. Not the beginning of a crisis, the end of a denial. The world has been reorganizing itself for years. This week, 3 of America's oldest allies stopped pretending it hadn't.